All right, y'all ready?
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay, Common Sense Medicine, another episode. And today, another special guest.
Yes.
Hey, Jackson.
Hi, how are y'all? I wasn't sure if that was my cue. I'm sorry.
Perfect.
No, it's perfect. Now, last week we talked about anxiety and depression. I guess we've been doing it for a couple of weeks now. Melissa, so Melissa's always here.
I'm still here.
Still here. That's right. And
Glad to be here.
That's right. Well, and last week, we talked about like moms. And that, I think, really resonated with a lot of listeners. But this week, we're going to talk about dads.
Yeah, we can't leave the dads out.
That's right. Yeah, and at first, Melissa, we talked and we thought like, oh, dads, and dad's like, everything's fine, period. And we're like, oh, that was a short episode. But actually, Jackson, you were doing some research on like depression, anxiety rates in men. It's actually high.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. I believe that 1 out of 10, according to like the AADA, 1 in 10 men are diagnosed with some sort of like anxiety or depression. And they think that it's significantly higher than that due to like underdiagnosis.
Yeah, I think men are probably less likely to seek help. And so, right, it's just out of the men who actually go in to be evaluated that actually are getting these diagnoses.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think even on that further statistics, suicide rates in men are significantly higher than women because, like you said, they don't ask for help. They don't seek it. And then it kind of gets out of control. And by the time it's at that red level, and of course, men, Melissa, you'll know, men are really good at hiding feelings and things like that. Or not just, we just maybe aren't taught to talk about it like women are. And so this is why we are doing this episode. So for guys, a way to talk about things, and for women, moms and wives, you can
I'll just be a fly on the wall and just, yeah,
you can
prepare to learn.
That's right. Whatever you want to know, Melissa, this is your chance to pick our brains. So yeah, we'll talk about anxiety, depression, maybe how it presents in men that might be a little different from women. We'll talk about things like that, maybe habits, ways to cope that are very destructive, that are unhealthy, and then maybe some healthier ways to cope. And we might even bring in some history and time, because really, Jackson, I feel like, our parents' generation, what men did versus what we do now as dads are actually pretty different.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So let's start there. We talk about anxiety, we talk about depression, we talk about mood, right? Like feeling sad, feeling down. But men don't always respond like that. In fact, most of the time when men come to our clinic to talk about depression, it's more like physical findings, maybe irritability, lack of concentration, stomach pain. I don't know. Is that what you hear too, Melissa, when they come and talk to you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there's sometimes fatigue, sometimes, just kind of lack of energy, like decreased, even things like decreased attention span, decreased libido, decreased, just enjoyment of things that they used to enjoy, whether it's a hobby or other things. They just don't really feel interested anymore.
Yeah. And in this day and age, of course, you hear things like testosterone and all these ads, right, that are coming out that tell you how you're supposed to be. But really, a lot of times underlying, once we start talking, it's depression. Depression is playing a role. It might not be major depressive disorder like diagnosed by a psychiatrist, but all the things, all the physical stuff, all the fatigue, drive, stomach pain, concentration issues, those are actually stemming from other issues, so now, Jackson, let's dig a little bit, right? I was looking at some studies. Really, for us, a lot of men and a lot of the sources of anxiety actually come from environmental things like family and work. I don't know if you had any personal experience with those.
Yeah, no. I just had my first kid almost a year and a half ago. And that definitely, it changes the entire dynamic. And with that comes with stress. And so finding appropriate ways to cope with that is definitely, it's been a different process because I used to cope differently and not always the healthiest of ways. I used to eat junk food like nonstop. And since I've been here learning to like adapt those habits to more healthier portrayals, I feel like has been definitely a big part of growing.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, that's a plug for Blue Health Baptist of how amazing we are. That's actually a really good point because Yeah, so we'll start there. Family, family for guys actually is a big stress area. And again, we have amazing wives, wonderful children, but it's just life. It's just something that, right. Talk about having children. It was just you and your wife, and she's independent. You're independent. Like, y'all could feed yourself. Right? You can do things. But once you add a kid in there, it does change the dynamic a lot. Not just between like, hey, I have to have a different relationship with my child, but also the relationship with the wife changes. I'll even say, like, my wife, once we had kids, her attention to detail for the kid is, heightened. But also to me, she's like, hey, you got to wash that this way. And before I'm like, what? I have to wash what? And so those are things that maybe that we think like this is supposed to happen, this is normal, and it is. I mean, that's what happens, but it is a big underlying stress ball that kind of festers.
For sure.
Yeah. Do you think that, like you mentioned earlier, the how the roles have evolved plays into some of that? Whereas, maybe when our parents were, as we were growing up in that generation, it was a lot of more like separated roles, like woman stays home, takes care of the household, man goes to work, and then just comes home and kind of that side of things is done as the provider and everything. And now those roles are a little bit more like blended and meshed, maybe both are working outside of the home, plus both are taking care of household duties. So do you think that kind of plays into that at all?
Oh, for sure. I think the most important thing from my experience is to have like a balance with your partner. Like somebody takes him to daycare, somebody picks him up. That way, no one person feels like they're doing the majority of it. Mm-hmm. That healthy like equality between you and your partner, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, Melissa, because I'm thinking back, and I don't know if your parents were like my parents or Jackson, your parents, but like I cannot even recall when my dad gave us a bath. Like bath time? Like, no, like, I mean, my dad, he worked hard, he got home usually like 6, and usually by then, like, my mom would have, food's cooked, the kids have set the table. We won't even eat before dad. We kind of wait for dad, then he sits down, we eat. But then after that, it's like when it's bedtime, it's essentially like, I think my dad would read us stories every once in a while, but it really was like my mom got us all cleaned up. We all took baths. She made us sure we changed our clothes, made sure we're all going to bed at a certain time. And I think my dad was just like sitting at the couch.
Because he had worked all day.
He worked all day. Yeah. So, I don't know if is that kind of how your parents were, or
a little bit. Ours was a little bit different, just because we had a farm for a lot of time. So
okay.
Yeah, both of them kind of participated in that, and then later on, even my mom went working outside of the home more. So I think there was maybe a pretty equal balance. To some extent, but still, it did feel like, yeah, if we needed anything, it was always go to mom. It was kind of one of those, like, just unwritten things. Like, we always just went to mom for, like, anything that we needed.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's because of just their roles or if that's just kind of, like, ingrained in us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, even now, right?
Right.
Go find mom.
Yeah. That still happens today. So.
Yeah. What about your family, Jackson?
So I've always had like a very unique relationship with my father. I was majorly raised by my mother, only because my father was in the Air Force. He was deployed overseas a majority of my life growing up. And thankfully, like when he wasn't overseas, he would be like very present and help out all the time. But it's just, I got to see my mom more. Like that's who I spent all my life with in middle school and high school. So it was definitely more like if I have any questions, I need to go to her.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, like you said, so obviously, if we grew up kind of watching these roles as how well they're defined, and I guess I've heard a lot of patients, they come home, now they're grown, right? The boys are grown. And when they married, they're actually maybe subconsciously expecting the same thing. Like they expect like, hey, when I get home from work, my mom had all the laundry done and all the food on the table and the kids are there. And how come when I come home to work, my wife hadn't done anything? And even if it's like, and even if like, hey, like Melissa, you work full time. Like my mind, like, yes, Melissa works full time. There's no way she can have everything done like maybe a mom who was staying at home. And even back then, the kids weren't having as many activities as we do now. But I wonder if that plays maybe something subconscious into what maybe a guy expects. And sometimes, a lot of the things with stress is like you have expectations, and if things don't meet expectations, that kind of can cause some, maybe not resentment, but just something not so easy not comfortable.
For sure. I'm very thankful that my mom, in my adolescent teenage years, she had her own job as well. So whenever I was home, I was doing I would help with laundry and I would help with the dishes. So I'm very thankful that she taught me that, because when I went to college and had to do all that stuff, I was familiar with how all that worked. But I know that not everyone shares the same perspective on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about kind of how men identify differently than women in a way, like just as the provider and head of the household and things like that. I think some of that is still very present, and maybe feels like a primary role. And yeah, you guys can kind of tell me how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's definitely still there. I feel as though, from my experience with my partner, we both have a role as caretaker, whether that, sometimes it alternates, who's taking care of my son every day, who's at work. 'Cause sometimes Kayla doesn't work, when I do, and then vice versa. Sometimes she's working when I'm not. So we both have a role as caretaker to our son, and then financially as well. But definitely a majority of, an older perspective is that these are defined roles that have to be stuck with. And that definitely has been perpetuated in some instances in modern culture.
Yeah, I think for us, so my mom was like, you're not going to be like your dad. Because she always jokes, my dad doesn't know how to use a microwave. If she tied a loaf of bread around his neck, he would starve to death. Yeah. So, she taught us, cooking, cleaning, everything, and so I feel very comfortable, cooking, cleaning, picking up kids, taking them to the park, putting them to bed, reading stories, the whole 9 yards is very comfortable, to me. But I think also still, in our family, any big decision still comes from me, so whatever, it's kind of, I guess, if you think about it as a company, it's the CEO still decides which direction this company is going, even though if he's not doing a lot of the day-to-day things. So in our family, we still have that role. But I can see if, I said, so obviously our younger generation is different, So if the guy had a thought that, hey, I'm supposed to lead this family this direction, but the wife's like, no, we're going in this direction, that sometimes can cause a lot of fighting between couples, which again is one of the, if you look at stress, that's almost one of the top reasons. It's just maybe miscommunications or not understanding or not communicating well with your significant other.
Yeah, for sure. Especially with major purchases like furniture, cars, things like that. People have very strong opinions on what they want. And definitely stuff like that can cause hostility. I don't know if that's the best word to use, but tension, I feel is.
Tension.
Yeah, I think that, financial decisions, and right, I think in a dynamic where maybe one person isn't bringing in, let's say, the same amount, or maybe, isn't responsible for the income, how do you divide that decision, and how does each person get an equal part without there being some type of conflict or tension?
Yeah. No, I think, the second thing on there was finances. Finances for men, that's probably one of the top things that guys worry about. In fact, I think most guys, when they come into our clinic, that's probably the top. That, financially, we're just really, really tight. And it might even be in people who make a whole lot of money, but they just are living at a means that are really, really high, to the point that, if they're in business and they miss that sale, or they don't close that account, the stress is huge, And I actually, even there was a patient in the past couple of months, he was just stressed out of his eyeballs, And we were just talking, and he's like, the way my wife wants to live does not allow us to, because I was like, maybe have you thought about, not go buying the lake house, and he's like, the way my wife wants to live, that's not possible, which I thought was, I don't know, it was sad, but you're like, wow, that might be something you can communicate. Because I feel like he was hiding it. He didn't want to show her that he is working his tail, working himself to the bone. But it was causing a lot of stress and anxiety. And actually, his main complaint coming in that day was just focus. He thought he had ADHD. But the moment we started talking, I was like, dude, I don't think you have ADHD. I think you're just stressed out of your, to your max.
Yeah, no, stress is definitely a big culprit of like anxiety and depression. There's like a healthy level of stress. I'm sure y'all are familiar preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
But just for like some people just don't expect, when it comes to like finances, family, the small stuff really does add up very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And hence, so we'll kind of move on because I think family, finances, those are probably your top two. Work was another one. Work is always a big one. Guys, we want to do something. I think we're designed to do something. And, as we get farther in our career, we want to do something impactful. And so sometimes work can be very, very stressful. But I think we move on, I guess because of time, coping with stress. I was looking for men, actually alcohol is probably one of the worst ways that we can cope. And the more that I talk to guys, that's actually one of you didn't think it was as big a deal as it is. And so you start talking to people and they're like, holy cow, we are drinking way too much alcohol.
Yeah. And what's worse about that is that the people will vary from what they consider a lot to not a lot. From personal experience, I know people that are like, oh, I don't drink very often. I have like 5 beers a day. And then it's just like, oh, I don't know what you're going through, but you should talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot. And, I think, just in general, men do metabolize alcohol a little bit differently so they can get by with a little bit more than women. And I think that does, some people will kind of push that limit and, not really realize how much it's affecting them until, they have a headache every day, they're tired every day. And then you realize, oh, well, they're actually just hungover because they're drinking excessively every night. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually, I guess to plug that in, something for guys, that is something to really pay attention to. Because we talk about all those other symptoms, right? We talked about lack of energy, lack of drive, lack of focus. All that could just be alcohol. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're stressed. Yes, now we're using alcohol to cope. And now alcohol is causing all those same symptoms that the stress was. Because, right, alcohol is a depressant. So it might make you feel numb for a little bit, but the moment it wears off, those feelings come right back. So that was one. Another one that it said that guys might do that's maybe a bad way to cope is seclusion. Mm-hmm. Now, I think I was reading that. I was like, okay, it's a little different than I'm going fishing for 5 hours. Especially if that's something they do all the time, right? Or they go hunting. They go hunting for 3-4 hours, but that's something that they do all the time. But this will be something like maybe they don't have any interest. They used to go hunting and now they don't. They just sit in their room and watch TV all the time or something like that.
Yeah. Or just zone out while hanging out with family or friends. Yeah. Just the eyes forward, glazed over kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's scary to see somebody go through that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think technology too can sometimes be another outlet or, just way to kind of zone out, whether that's, phones, gaming, different things like that. There are healthy levels of that. And then there are, excessive levels that can sometimes contribute to that social isolation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's kind of so a guy, let's say he zones out, he's playing video games and the wife comes in and they're like, you've been playing too long. And sometimes that can cause friction. So it's kind of
and he's like, well, I've been at work. I just want to decompress or whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And next, the area of escape, I think we talked about this last year with women, they go on social media to escape and they end up getting all these opinions that made their anxiety worse. Guys can have the same, they go to games to escape, but now they feel like they're getting nagged on and it just kind of, it kind of escalates. So those are, I guess, things for guys specifically, if you start feeling like we're secluding ourselves a little bit more, we're taking substances a little bit more, something that maybe hey, you might need to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is the third thing is that guys just don't talk to anybody. That is actually a big one because I feel like women, they're maybe more easy to talk about their emotions. Guys, whether it's society, culture, you know, how we were raised, whatever, oftentimes guys don't talk about things. And I think, Jackson, you told me that sometimes men, they feel like, why do I talk about it? Because no one will care.
Yeah. I feel like I might have the movie wrong, but I feel like The League of Their Own, it's some baseball movie, and I could be completely wrong with which one it is. But there's just a quote that's like, there's no crying in baseball, because it's a primarily male dominated sport. It just kind of further perpetuates that. I'd like to think that we're as a society, getting better about, welcoming the expression of, men's struggles, but it's definitely still there, especially like in major media like that.
Yeah. And I think even just, how we treat our boys, you know, if a girl falls down and scrapes her knee, you know, get her a Band-Aid, whatever. If a boy falls down, it's like, oh, you're fine, buddy.
Walk it
off. It's fine. And I think that conditions males early on that, you don't have to show your emotions if you're hurting. You know?
Yeah. So, and I think, you know, that's even now, you know, as dads, that's something that you can raise into your sons, right? Like, I mean, yes, you don't want them to become over analyzing their feelings because that can become a tar baby where people just sit there and like, am I doing this? And they're like, no, don't over analyze. There is a time to be tough and a time to like pick yourself up and keep going. But it's also okay for boys to like cry, you know, and if you are feeling sad and if you're bullied, like talk to your parents, you know, like you can open those conversations, because that's when people don't talk, that's when bad things happen, you know, and even for us as adults, you know, sometimes it might not be your spouse. You might not be able to talk. There are things that I feel like when husbands and wife talk, like I'll tell my wife something and she'll get mad at me and her best friend will tell the exact same thing. She's like, that's so wise. And I'm like, that's what I said. But it goes both ways. You know, sometimes talking to your doctor or talking to a therapist, which now we're going on healthy ways to cope, like talking to somebody, a third party that is not pro you or against you, you know, that will give you honest feedback actually is really, really helpful. And it will also help with a lot of the physical symptoms that manifest with stress. Yeah. So a couple of things to talk about. Definitely feel free to talk with people. If it is your spouse, fantastic. Talk to her. If it's not, it's your best friend. It's, you know, don't go on social media. Don't do that same pitfall, because that is like a bad area to be. But yeah, talking to people is important. Another way that's healthy is exercise. Exercise is really, really good for stress relief. And I would even tell people the more you feel like you don't have time to exercise because you're so stressed, the more you need to find time to exercise because it increases your mood. It gets rid of all that fight or flight energy that you've been storing all day long. Plus, I mean, it's also you time. Like it's time for you to kind of get out, you know?
Yeah. And I think kind of just along with that as other healthy things, you know, in addition to the exercise, maybe steering clear of sometimes the substances. And it may not be alcohol. It may be that you feel like you have to kind of keep going with caffeine all day, you know, or junk food or different things. Like you said, you were kind of coping with junk food just to kind of help with the stress and anxiety. But maybe redirecting some of that, you know, instead of going to the pantry, maybe, just walk around outside for 5 minutes. It doesn't even have to be a formal exercise session. Just like take a breather, get outside and move a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I had to do. I had to basically throw out my stash of jelly beans that I kept in my cabinet, and then just like promise myself every day after work, just at the very least go run a mile. Just do something to get you out and active.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's huge. I mean, like I said, I think we've talked about before, Melissa, and Jackson, you hear our stuff, but you have to find a way to release that fight or flight. You know, it's bad for you metabolically. It's bad for our health. Like I said, junk food, yes, it's a quick dopamine hit. You know, that's what they are. You know, social media, alcohol, these are really quick dopamine hits that kind of make things feel good. But in the long run, it's just not helpful for anybody. And it's so funny that it comes down to the basics. Like, you know, certain foods make mood worse. So watching that, eating maybe more whole foods, not exercising makes mood worse. So getting out there, moving, mental health, talking to people. And, I guess after talking about all this, if you feel like your wife is your big stress because she's spending too much on makeup and cars or whatever it is, it's okay to talk to your spouse about it and just kind of let them know this is what you're feeling. And I don't think if your husband told, they might freak you out almost like, what are you telling me? Sorry. But it's not like, it's okay to do things like that.
Yeah. I think most women would agree that if their husband was struggling with something, don't just go and like cover it up with other things or, seek advice from, strangers on the internet or, guys at work, whatever. Yeah. And it's good to talk about things with people, but yeah, just tell us, I think that's the biggest part. Cause again, like we talked about last week, we can't read each other's minds. So unless we, speak up and say what we're thinking and how we're feeling, we'll never know.
Yeah, definitely. Cause that like hostility, if there's tension there, it just breeds more. Yeah, it becomes dangerous. And the person that you're going to be spending most of your time with needs to be somebody that you can talk to.
Yeah.
Correct. Because home needs to be an area where there's a lot of peace, right? Home needs to be an area where there's like comfort. Home is an area where there's safety, even for guys too. And so if there's a lot of tension where I have some guys like, I don't know if I want to go home, or they bury themselves in their work so they don't have to go home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or that's how relationships get destroyed. That's how bad things happen. Even things like how you raise your children. That is something you want to talk to your wife. If you feel like, because, people grow up in two different cultures or two different ideologies, you can agree to disagree or come to a middle point, because I feel like raising children is a big one too. But it sounds like the tie-in point is communicate.
Yes.
Communicate and don't drink. And exercise. So, that was a lot longer than I thought we were going to talk about. Guys can talk about feelings, right? We have CPR coming.
Yes.
So any closing thoughts, Jackson or Melissa?
No, not really. Just for any men listening, just know that it is okay to talk about this stuff, whether or not that is with your significant other or a trusted third party. Just know that your feelings are valued and warranted.
Yeah, I second that. That's exactly what I would have said.
I know. That sounds like it was going on a Hallmark card. Good job, Jackson. And if anyone has ever met Jackson, the rule of thumb is just be Jackson. So if you're Jackson, you're doing great. So, all right. Thank you, Jackson, for your time.
Thank you for having me.